Great. Well, welcome. This was quite an event for us this evening. A lot of work went into this. A lot of people behind the scenes, a lot were involved. So I'll say a few things about that, and a word of thanks for some people. But before I do that, I'd like to start off with our land acknowledgement. As we always begin here in the law school, we begin by acknowledging that Dalhousie University operates in the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoqey, and the Besquetumakati peoples. These sovereign nations hold inherent rights as the original peoples of these lands, and we each carry collective obligations under the Peace and Friendship Treaties. Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982, recognizes and affirms Aboriginal rights in Canada. We are all treaty people. I also want to acknowledge, it's very important to us here in the law school and at Dalhousie, that we recognize that African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched that part of Mi'kma'ki known as Nova Scotia for over 400 years. So welcome to this event. We are extremely excited to be co-hosting this with a number of other organizations. I'll say something about them in a moment. As some of you might know, Alex Neve, who is the reason we're all here at the moment, comes here every year to teach a one-credit course for us on international human rights advocacy. So we're extremely lucky to have his presence here every year doing that. And when he suggested, it would have been last summer, last spring, that because he was doing the Massey Lectures, might he tack on a public lecture, we started talking about just doing a law hour for our law students. Alex sort of pushed a little bit and said, no, I think we can do something a little bigger and a little better and bring more people in and have a more of a footprint and more of an impact. So this has turned into something much larger and truly more wonderful as a broader community event. The theme of Alex's Massey Lectures and this lecture today could not be more timely or more important. We are living in absolutely strange and outrageous times, and so much of his work addresses that and helps us think through it and maybe even be a little bit hopeful at the end of all of it. So many thanks to the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. I know at the very end, the Dean, Jennifer Andrews, will get up and say thank you as well. But many thanks to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, to the Del Air Institute. Shelley is all the way back there. And the Center for the Study of Security and Development for their help in pulling all this event together. And whenever I thank anybody up here for an event, one always has to include Elizabeth, who is always not in the room. She is running around doing something. Many of you know Elizabeth Sanford. She really helps pull these things together. She is amazing and always ensures these things go like clockwork. So thank you to Elizabeth, even though you're not here. So I believe our host for the evening, Jeff Douglas, will be introducing all of the speakers, but I would like to take this opportunity to thank them all for being here to the law school and participating in the evening. I'll just quickly introduce them without saying anything about them. But there is Tareq Hadhad, better known as Peace by Chocolate. There is Tanha Tanjila at the end, who's from the International Development Studies Program. There's Heather Tasker there in the middle from Political Science. Kristin Belanger, who is from here in the law school. She works in our library. And of course, Alex Neve, who I don't know if you know, is actually a 1987 graduate of this law school, and not too many years ago, just a few years ago, won our highest alumni recognition, the Weldon Award for Unselfish Public Service. Could not have gone to a better person, and so it's always delightful to have Alex back. Two quick plugs before I turn things over to Jeff. When we're done for the evening, there are books of the Massey Lecture that are out in the lobby. I'm sure you saw them, and so they're there. And there's also chocolate. The chocolate, I don't know where the chocolate came from, but the chocolate is also a fundraiser for Dallaire. So you make sure you pick up all the chocolate you need for the next 10 years when you leave the event. So with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator for the evening, CBC Nova Scotia's Mainstreet host, Jeff Douglas.
Thank you very much for that. I'm very, very pleased to be here and quite honored to be here. I want to say hello. I don't know if there's anyone in the overflow, but I want to acknowledge that folks are out there. Before we begin, I just want to say a few words and also kind of set out some rules of engagement, I guess, for the evening. But to start with, I'd like to ground us, if I could, in something quite simple. At our core, my firm belief is that our basic desires as human beings are universal, and they're not complicated. We want to be safe, and we want to be free from suffering. Everything else we do, whatever we add to our lives, are for our families, for our communities, grow out of those drives. I believe that. And if we're honest, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to get to that point. We know that when we're still, when we're not being pulled by outrage or by fear or the daily churn of news. We know this instinctively. That said, as the Dean said, we are living in interesting times. I think that is the understatement, perhaps, of the millennium. We're living in a moment that makes stillness next to impossible. The state of the world, the pace of current affairs, daily evidence of injustice can create a real anxiety. That's even the appropriate word, because it's a real feeling. It's a legitimate, valid feeling. For many of us, a genuine sense of pessimism about where things are headed. I want to start by acknowledging that and acknowledging the validity of that feeling and the outrage and the passion that we all feel. But I also do want to name something else. The fact that we still, as individuals, believe in our heart of hearts in the universality of human rights, and that we mourn the distance between that ideal and our reality, that is, I don't believe, an evidence of failure. It's an evidence of something deeper and something more hopeful. It tells us that however imperfectly we may be living up to it now, we recognize that universal human rights are the only real foundation for a healthy, resilient global economy. So the aim of this evening is not to deny challenges, the challenges that are in front of us, or to gloss over this hard time, these hard truths, but to approach them constructively. This is a space for thoughtful disagreement, for collaboration, for imagination. Again, anger, passion is understandable, but tonight I ask you to just, if we can, park that in the service of ideas and insight and forward motion. So after the keynote and the panel discussion, we will make room for questions from those of you in the room. I'll just ask one thing in advance. These folks up here are the ones here to give speeches. I just asked that. So please do, I know you've been working on your treaties and your manifestos. Let's not do that here tonight. Let's keep our questions focused and precise. Not because the issues aren't complex, but because we want to just hear from as many folks as possible. So again, tonight is not about pretending that the world is better than it is, but it is about refusing the idea or addressing the idea that it could be better and that it should be better. Universal human rights are not naive. They are not utopian. They are a hard-won lesson of history. We learn it again and again that safety and dignity and freedom from suffering are not privileges to be granted, but they're conditions that must be defended if any society is going to endure. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote tonight. Alex Neve is a visiting and adjunct professor in international human rights law at the University of Ottawa in Dal, and a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. He presently serves as a member of the UN Human Rights Council's independent international fact-finding mission on Venezuela. Interesting time to be on that panel. He was Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada's English branch from 2000 to 2020. He is a lawyer with a master's degree in international human rights law from the University of Essex, rather. Soon to be renamed. Sorry, I have Alex's notes here. This is, I should have trusted my own. The University of Essex. Alex was, of course, the 2025 CBC Massey Lecturer addressing the theme of universal, renewing human rights in a fractured world. Alex Neve is an officer of the Order of Canada. Alex.
Thank you so much for that, Jeff, and I want to go to that university. I just made a spur-of-the-moment decision to come down here, so Elizabeth, forgive me if I mess things up, and it was because I suddenly was looking out at all of you and realizing I spent 3 years of a law degree sitting there while professors were standing here. So tonight's my night. And thank you so much to everyone for coming. I know we're going to have, as we've been doing this across the country in big cities and small towns, a whole range of different kinds of audiences, but everywhere the conversation has been so meaningful. And it's really brought home, perhaps not surprisingly, but very, very significantly to me how important it is for us to be finding the ways and opportunities to come together, yes, to talk about our world, the despairing, broken state of our world, but the hopeful possibilities that something like universal human rights offer us in terms of a way forward. And that's the word I'm going to begin with, universal. It comes from the Latin. It's a law school, you have to talk a little Latin every once in a while. Universus, altogether, whole, entire. And it is a word, an idea that is all-encompassing, because it is for everyone and everywhere. And at times it does shout with confidence. And when on full display, it is truly magnificent. In other moments, it speaks tentatively, and its full extent eludes us. And when we are honest, we acknowledge that universality is far too often deliberately betrayed. We live in a time of global turmoil, hate, and division. Truth is under siege and disinformation is on the rise. Legal and democratic norms and institutions are under attack. On a rapidly warming planet, we face the gravest ever threat to our very survival. The inherent sacredness of human life is aggressively contested from countless directions. This is not universality's finest hour, but it can be. In the raw aftermath of the Second World War and the Holocaust, as governments elaborated the world's first global human rights promises, this is the word they chose. In 1948, they proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And universal was a very unconventional title for an international legal instrument. Deliberately so. The drafters of the Declaration, the states that voted to adopt it, were saying, this is for all of us. Well, in 2026, the word still packs a powerful punch, but it also screams to us of our profound failure to keep the promise. For we are far from a world in which the human rights of all are universally acknowledged, let alone respected. what we confidently placed at the core of the promise, its universality, is above all else where we have fallen short. But even as that maelstrom of violence, hate, and lies frays the fabric of universal human rights, billions of people continue to hold the promise close. They resist and organize precisely because the promise is universal. They do so even though the promise is withheld from them. Here, universality is linked to courage and imagination. It is fueled by conviction and hard work. It is nourished by solidarity. And it speaks truth that ultimately cannot be denied. This universality rises above divisive lies and manufactured hate. This universality yearns to unite us in something hopeful and good. In early 2019, while interviewing Rohingya refugees who had fled genocidal attacks in Myanmar and were now living in overcrowded and dangerous refugee camps in Bangladesh, I spoke with Mohammed Salim. We spoke about drowning. We drowned in waves of violence and hate spread by Facebook in Myanmar, he said. We drowned as we made our way across the Neve River. Our boat had holes in it and the water was pouring in. We have nearly drowned many times here in the camp when the monsoons have brought rain and mud. Our desperate friends and family drown when they go out into the Bay of Bengal, hoping to make it somewhere safe, but their unsafe ships are sunk or lost. Now they want to drown us by sending us out to live on a flooded sandbar island. And we drown every day in the camp because we are locked up like criminals, don't have enough food, and our children are not allowed to go to school. We, Rohingya, are forgotten and left to drown. But when I learned about the Universal Declaration, he said, I knew that it holds promise as a lifeboat. Well, you can well imagine that the last thing I expected to see as I stooped to enter Mohammed's tiny, immaculate shelter in Jamtoli refugee camp was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But there it was, faded and curled at the edges, pinned to the central post supporting the blue plastic sheeting that was home to Mohammed, his wife, their 4 young children, and his wife's elderly parents. Drowning is an apt metaphor for all that the Rohingya have been through. Drowning literally while crossing rivers or taking to the high seas to reach safety, or when faced with the wrath of monsoon rains and flooding. Drowning figuratively under waves of violence and hate in person and online, and a punitive existence in the refugee camps. Drowning with no end in sight. As Rohingya refugees fled genocidal violence in Myanmar in 2017, the world was moved by the ferocious attacks and indescribable suffering inflicted upon them. But with a global shrug of indifference, their plight seems now to be long forgotten. What was most compelling about my conversation with Mohammed is that it ended not in the hopelessness I might have expected, but with that sense of hope. For he truly did see hope promised in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that lifeboat for humanity. Yet, the world has yet to ensure that the lifeboat will be seaworthy. Mohammed's experience speaks to so many of our world's ongoing ruptures. Mass atrocities and repression, the climate crisis, hate and polarization, economic deprivation, the reach of social media, and the immense scale of forced displacement in our world. These crises are not only urgent, they are existential. They go deep into the heart of how we live our lives, how we view each other, and how we relate to the natural world on which our very existence depends. All the more daunting, given that the rules-based, those were quotes, legal frameworks we have counted on to bring some degree of order to our world is collapsing. The United Nations is more deadlocked than ever under the Security Council's dysfunctional watch, enabled by the disgraceful veto power wielded by 3 of the 5 permanent members, the United States, Russia, and China, without the slightest concern for law, morality, or just plain human decency. Under their watch, genocide marches on in Gaza, where the humanity of Palestinians is denied, and their plight is now left in the hands of Donald Trump's Board of Peace. The blatantly unlawful invasion of Ukraine is never taken up, not one single resolution. The unilateral and illegal US armed incursion into Venezuela, nothing. And a US veto would clearly block any Security Council response that might be needed regarding Greenland. And the massacre of more than 3,000 protesters on the streets of Iran, again, nothing. And while wrenching crises in Sudan, Afghanistan, and Myanmar deepen, so too does the normalization of inaction. Awash in a sea of disinformation and the morass of the demise of truth, we are left with an increasingly wobbly tiller in our lifeboat, held together with rubber bands and duct tape with which to navigate those turbulent waters. But we do indeed have that lifeboat. And no matter how leaky or wobbly, Mohammed Salim and millions upon millions of people everywhere are intent on steering it to safe harbor. And so must we. Delivering the Massey Lectures has given me the opportunity to explore the frank reality, the urgent necessity, and the magnificent possibility of the promise of universal human rights with people in communities large and small across the breadth of our country. The high-level takeaway, spoiler alert, is that I have heard hope at every stop along the way. Hope that rests, yes, in deep, deep concern, but in determination to work for change. And that has been on display in every audience. I sense that hope and determination in you having come to join us tonight. The lectures began with heavy recognition that our world is indeed fractured in so many ways. Fractures that have ruptured the human rights of billions of people. Fractures, though, that can be healed by a true embrace of the universal promise. I've looked back and reminded us of the essential beliefs and truths that lie behind the promise, going back far, millennia, in fact, long before it was enshrined in the Universal Declaration in 1948. Life is sacred. We are joined together in our common humanity. We all yearn for and deserve fairness and freedom. Powerfully captured, amongst others, by the African concept of Ubuntu. I am because we are. I've taken stock of our unforgivable failure to acknowledge that universal human rights are inherent and inalienable, meaning we are all born with them. We don't do anything to earn them, and they can never be stripped away. We never do anything to lose them. But instead, human rights have become rather an exclusive club, haven't they? Steeped in white, moneyed, patriarchal privilege. And though membership has expanded minimally and selectively, the clubhouse remains surrounded by fences of geopolitics, money, national security, intolerance, and indifference, which at times seem unbreachable. I have also highlighted the incredible power of people, be it one person acting courageously or millions of people resisting, to make change happen in our world. Change that always begins with one person who demands that it be so. As was the case one day in October 2002, A woman who introduced herself as Monia Mazig called the Amnesty International office and was put through to me. Her husband, Meher Arar, a Canadian citizen, had been arrested while changing planes in New York City on his way home to Ottawa from a family trip to Tunisia. Monia was concerned that he might be sent to Syria, where he had been born. And after 2 weeks in detention in Brooklyn, Meher was indeed subject to extraordinary rendition to Syria by way of a CIA ghost plane, and he endured a year of unlawful detention and torture. Monia, meanwhile, mounted a truly heroic campaign to win Meher's freedom. She made herself available to journalists and sought the support of parliamentarians. Most shied away at first, not wanting to associate themselves with anything related to the United States and terrorism allegations. But her persistence gained momentum, and Meher's plight became one of the top political issues in the country. And finally, on October the 5th, 2003, he was released and returned home. But that was not the end. Meher and Monia called for a public inquiry, stressing that accountability was crucial to ensure this would not happen again. It was a tall order to convince any government to subject its national security practices to that level of scrutiny in the still raw aftermath of 9/11. But to his credit, Prime Minister Paul Martin did indeed convene a judicial inquiry. And after 2 years of hearings, the presiding judge, Justice Dennis O'Connor, released 2 voluminous reports. He exonerated Meher, leading to an official apology and compensation from the government. He also made numerous recommendations for strengthened oversight of Canada's national security and law enforcement agencies. That, in turn, eventually led to creation of 2 new bodies, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians and the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency. And last year, legislation was passed to establish a 3rd, the Public Complaints and Review Commission, to oversee the Canada Border Services Agency and the RCMP. Now, Monia and Meher's story is important for many reasons, but this is why I wanted to share it tonight. These enormously consequential changes occurred for one simple reason. Monia Mazig was determined to win her husband's freedom. Change begins with one person. Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has said that our world faces a stark choice between 2 paths. One of enlightened cooperation and solidarity, stable and seeking balance with our natural world. The other, unmistakably dystopian. Clearly, we seek that first path, but there has always been an excuse to wander off it. Instead, markets, wars, geopolitics, and securitization rule. We idealists are told by the pragmatists that this is how problems are solved in the real world. Yet I don't know about you, but it's pretty clear to me, pragmatism has failed colossally, and we are looking straight down that dystopian path. So what of the other path? As my good friend and colleague Pam Palmiter, a Dow Law PhD grad, professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, citizen of the Mi'kmaq Nation, and a member of Eel River Bar First Nation, told my international human rights class at the University of Ottawa last year, imagine all the good we could do and the better country and world we would live in for Indigenous peoples and all of humanity if we actually gave human rights their turn, just as we have always said we would. Well, we give human rights their turn by first getting our own house in order, by acknowledging our history of genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada and committing to genuine reconciliation. by ending blatant double standards in our human rights diplomacy, such as our divergent and imbalanced approach over the decades to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and our abject silence more recently, no matter how low Donald Trump goes with his dismantling of the global human rights regime. By putting universal human rights at the heart of climate policy. Pipelines, anyone? And trade deals, such as, for instance, when chasing a new economic partnership with China, which leaves human rights completely out of the equation. And by taking our international human rights obligations seriously here at home, demonstrating that we expect of ourselves nothing less than what we demand of the rest of the world. In fact, we must thoroughly reimagine the place of universal human rights in our world. This is a moment to elevate human rights and challenge ourselves to live our lives differently. The universal human rights renewal that I imagine has 6 key elements. Put human rights first, embrace universality and commit to equality, protect human rights defenders and the right to protest, ensure justice, be expansive, and believe in and champion human rights. Number 1, put human rights first. There is always an excuse for putting human rights on hold, isn't there? One day, not now. There are other priorities. Human rights will be a distraction or too expensive. Honestly, we just don't care. That anguish is captured in Omar El-Akkad's powerful book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. I'm sure many of you have read it. A devastating critique of the world's failure to act to end genocide in Gaza. He writes, when finally there is no other means of preserving self-interest but to act, the powerful will act. The same people who did the killing and financed the killing and justified the killing and turned away from the killing will congratulate themselves on doing the right thing. It is very important to do the right thing, eventually. Well, universal human rights were never intended to be left for that eventual one day. They were to be the starting point. That is why the Universal Declaration talks of human rights being the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in our world. The foundation, not some sort of leaky roof. Delaying human rights robs them of their purpose. Human rights do not rise to the top after a people have been decimated by genocide, are not something to think about after we are ravaged by climate harms. They do not come to the fore after economic policy and trade deals have gutted a community of their livelihood. So how about an international human rights action plan? We've actually never had one. Backed by an ambassador for human rights. Never had one. To bring consistency and heft to our human rights diplomacy. Similarly, a nationwide framework for international human rights implementation championed by ministers with explicit human rights mandates. We don't have that either. To ramp up domestic compliance with Canada's international human rights obligations. Putting human rights first surely also requires a concerted effort to ratify all outstanding human rights treaties yet to be taken up by Canada, of which there are, and you may be surprised to hear, many that we have simply pushed to the side. Number 2, embrace universality and commit to equality. When human rights are upheld for some people, but not everyone, in some places, not everywhere, and sometimes, not always, and when some rights matter and others not so much, clearly universality is nowhere to be found. At a time when equality rights are under attack from so many governments, including our closest ally, Canada needs to offer substantial diplomatic, political, and financial support for, and I'm going to use the 3 words, diversity, equity, and inclusion around the world. as a hallmark of Canadian foreign policy. Imagine just for a moment if we devoted even a minuscule fraction of the 5% of our GDP that is to be steered towards the military to such initiatives. Here at home, embracing universality means full respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples. All jurisdictions should incorporate the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into their laws, and we must all embrace our shared responsibility to live up to that declaration. How many of us have our own personal reconciliation commitment? We should. And a particular shout out for refugees who are, despite the attitude of many governments, actually fully entitled to the universal human rights promise. Should we not, therefore, suspend the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement so that refugees who are not by any measure safe in the United States, less and less so every passing day, are able to access refugee protection in Canada? Frankly, I think it's a disgrace that we have not taken that step. Number 3, protect human rights defenders and the right to protest. To our collective shame, human rights defenders often pay with their lives simply for trying to make the universal human rights promise real. That persecution has now also become transnational, with numerous governments, notably China, India, Russia, Iran, targeting activists and journalists in other countries as well, including here in Canada. And when demonstrators take to the streets to defend human rights, governments of all stripes, repressive and democratic, seek to break protest movements, often with brutal force. My heart breaks with both sorrow and admiration for the legions of protesters out on the streets of Iran and the incredible price they have paid. We need to recognize the essential role of human rights defenders and peaceful protest in society as sentinels of human rights protection and the lifeblood of democracy. Thus, defenders and protesters around the world must be able to count on the Canadian government to have their back. And here at home, we need a national action plan to protect human rights defenders in our communities as well, including Indigenous land defenders who continue to be criminalized for taking that stand. And there's an obvious need for nationwide guidelines for upholding the right to protest across the country, fully and consistently, be it in front of Parliament, on university campuses, homelessness encampments, or out on the streets. Number 4, ensure justice. Enforcement of the universal promise is nigh impossible if there is no effective remedy to turn to when rights are violated. Consider this. At the United Nations, Canada accepts individual complaints of civil and political rights violations, but not of economic, social, and cultural rights violations. That means I can pursue justice internationally if my rights to free expression or a fair trial have been violated, but not if I have been denied access to adequate housing or safe water. Pursuing an effective remedy for human rights abuses by companies also remains elusive in Canada. And while there has been some progress, uneven and tentative, in the drive to ensure that individuals who are responsible for mass atrocity crimes face justice, witness the growing but always challenging caseload of the International Criminal Court, Canada has not kept at all pace with other countries in ensuring that our national courts here at home play their part in delivering international justice. We need to increase our support for the International Criminal Court, the establishment of which, I'm sure many of us remember, Canada did, after all, champion, and push back, and certainly not remain silent as we have done when the court's personnel, including a Canadian judge, are subject to political attacks and sanctions from south of the border. And while we're at it, how about curtailing resort to the notwithstanding clause in the Charter? Increasingly used to deny human rights remedies, not for the rich and powerful, but for the most marginalized, vulnerable, and disenfranchised communities in society. Any promise rises or falls on whether it is kept. Wishful thinking is not enough. When the universal human rights promise is broken, justice must step in. Number 5, I'm getting there. Be expansive. Renewing human rights compels us to ensure the promise responds to needs that were not yet imagined when the Universal Declaration was written in 1948. For human rights, while universal, are not static. They are multifaceted and dynamic, and they must evolve as we evolve. By any measure, the overriding threat to human rights in our world is the spiraling climate crisis, something that was not envisioned in the slightest in 1948. To ensure the planet does not die, people around the world are recognizing nature's own rights. The Magpie River in northern Quebec has been granted legal personhood, meaning it is not simply an object to exploit, but a person to be protected. So yes, be expansive. That certainly must also extend to the distribution of wealth in our world. We need an economy that makes deliberate linkages to human rights in such areas as taxation, debt, public services, and climate finance. I don't think I heard enough about that from Davos yesterday. And what of technology? The dizzying digital advances of the past decade bring enormous human rights advantages, and they absolutely do. But they cause staggering human rights harms and are becoming irreversibly embedded in our lives. The challenge, a considerable one, is to find the sweet spot that embraces the good and banishes the bad. Solutions are not always easy and obvious, but we do know that leaving that in the hands of social media and technology billionaires has predictably been a colossal failure. It is tempting, of course it is, to retreat to safeguarding existing rights frameworks that are under such attack. But we must be expansive. We must ensure human rights are relevant to the challenges of today, including by evolving our understanding of human rights. And finally, believe in and champion human rights. Elie Wiesel's powerful words, accepting and holding on to the Nobel Peace Prize, little dig, in 1986, should be our mantra. We must always take sides, he said. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. And you all know Martin Luther King's famous words, reminding us that in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Indeed, we must forge the world in which there is no silence because we stand together in solidarity with those whose rights are on the line. And in doing so, we make it clear that we are not indifferent to genocide, to a burning planet, to sexism, racism, and discrimination, to erasing trans lives, to shutting borders, to refugees, or to homelessness. We are certainly not indifferent to our responsibility to advance rights regarding reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and we will never be indifferent to breaking the promise of universal human rights. The high road is the right road, and silence is not an option. Hate does not overcome hate, and denying someone's rights in response to their denial of my rights takes us precisely nowhere. Look for where common ground offers space to open dialogue and build understanding. Wouldn't it be magnificent if we regularly convened what I'll call people's human rights assemblies, bringing together Indigenous peoples, civil society, human rights commissions, governments, business, and the public, to share perspectives, build awareness, foster great commitment, and learn how to move forward together, talking the talk and walking the walk when it comes to universal human rights. The point is this: when we believe, when we are empowered and bound to one another in solidarity, when we spread the word and protest, when we overcome doubt by making human rights real, when we defend human rights, when we set out to make change happen, even against enormous odds, we can and we do prevail. Back in October in Labrador, Cheyenne Michel, a young Innu woman from Shahadje First Nation spoke to me about what human rights mean to her the day before I was delivering the Massey lecture there. Her words go to the very heart of the universal promise, for as she said to me, it is all about the right to belong. That means that we all must join in and make it clear that everyone, every single one of us does belong. We will not allow anyone to be set aside. For all that was honest, necessary, timely, and even courageous in Prime Minister Carney's speech at the World Economic Forum yesterday, for me, that was the missing piece, which surely must be at the heart of any new world order, that we all belong. Our collective determination has advanced the universal promise of human rights in the past, very often. And it can and it must do so again, because the promise is ours. The promise belongs to us. The Charter of the United Nations does, after all, begin with 3 simple but very big words. We, the peoples. Thank you very much.
All right, Alex, thank you. And just no shame, but going to give everyone a chance to silence your phones before we go any further. And I'm going to introduce the panelists now in do we have a particular order of, no, okay. Let's go left to right. Kristin Belanger. Kristin Belanger is a proud member of Glooscap First Nation. She holds a Bachelor of Arts as well as a Juris Doctor and a Master of Information, all from DAL. She is dedicated to promoting a holistic understanding of the interwoven fields of law, governance, and information. She began working as an instruction and public service librarian at the Sir James Dunn Law Library in 2025. And in this role, she teaches legal research and writing, supports students' research needs, and works to build space for Indigenous legal orders within the library physically, intellectually, and relationally. She also works with the Indigenous Law Lodge. Thank you so much, Kristin. Where she supports and conducts Indigenous legal research with a particular interest in navigating the intersection of Indigenous knowledge, cultural expressions, and intellectual property. So that's Kristin Belanger. And next to her, Tareq Hadhad is telling his story. Tareq was a Syrian refugee, is now living his new life with his entrepreneurial and somewhat famous family on Canada's East Coast. He is the founder and CEO of Peace by Chocolate, and most recently has been recognized as one of the top 50 CEOs in Atlantic Canada by Atlantic Business Magazine. Tareq's family home and father's factory that housed the family chocolate making business were destroyed during the war in Syria. A new life began when the Hadhad family were welcomed to Canada on a community-based sponsorship. Passionate about peace and entrepreneurship, the Hadhad family relaunched the family business to recreate the chocolates that they once exported across the Middle East. And their story has turned into an international inspiring phenomenon. A book about the family story has become a bestseller, and a feature film, also based on the family's journey, premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival and won several festival awards and accolades. In January of 2020, Tareq received his Canadian citizenship, which garnered international attention and has become one of the greatest accomplishments of his life. He has done over 1,000 interviews with me alone, with various news teams across the globe, and is very grateful to have opportunities to share his story and the impact of newcomers with audiences across the globe. Heather Tasker. Dr. Heather Tasker is an assistant professor in the Department of Poli-Sci and the Law, Justice and Society program at DAL. Dr. Tasker's research conducted in collaboration with community-based partners explores gendered violence in conflict-affected contexts through the lenses of transitional justice, human rights, and feminist security studies. Current projects explore the inclusion and exclusion of gendered violence survivors within justice processes in Liberia and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and examines the relationship between gender-based violence and forced displacement in the DRC and South Sudan. Dr. Tasker is also studying peacekeeping and humanitarian aid worker perpetrated sexual exploitation and abuse across 6 country contexts to assess the scale of the problem, improve access to justice, and determine how these harms can be better prevented and mitigated. And then Tanha Tanjila. Tanha is an educator and a graduate candidate at DAL, where her research examines how government policy changes affect Canada's humanitarian commitments and citizen-led refugee resettlement. She teaches settlement-specific English to 400 plus newcomers at ISANS in Halifax and volunteers with community organizations supporting refugee education and resettlement. Tanha has extensive experience in youth mobilization as a campus mobilization officer at WUSC, engaging 200 plus youth across 43 post-secondary institutions in Ontario on forced migration, refugee education, and youth empowerment. She mentors international students on career development, and in 2024 received the Dalhousie Board of Governors Award for her leadership and community service. Her ongoing research interests include minority rights and Indigenous rights within territorial nation states, children, peace and security, decolonizing, development research, and youth movements. She recently co-edited a book titled Children, Peace and Security, published by McGill Queen's University Press, and authored a chapter analyzing Bangladesh's monsoon revolution, highlighting youth roles in social justice and political reform. So I will leave it up to you. Tanha, you want to go? You're chomping at the bit.
Yeah, we'll
Do you have somewhere to be?
Right. Hello, everybody. Good evening. So I was posed with the question, what does universality in the universal human rights mean to me? And as a person of faith, one of the quotes in Islam that has always resonated with me, it says, none of you are true believers until you like for others what you like for yourself. And that has profoundly shaped how I approach this topic of universal human rights. To me, the universality of human rights means everybody in the world gets equal access to opportunities regardless of their race, gender, culture, religion, social status. To put simply, the person next to me or in front of me is as human as me and is deserving of the same dignity and rights regardless of our differences is the essence of human rights for me. And sorry, I was just getting emotional a little bit. So, for me, inequality and marginalization in any form is opposite of that universality of human rights. And my questions around this has led me to do the work I do, the kind of research I do. And given the state of our current world and the kinds of human rights violations we are constantly being exposed to, it can sometimes feel like we are unable to make any meaningful change or contribute in a meaningful way. And it can make us feel powerless, hopeless, and that's what precisely they want. They want to feel us that they want to make us feel that we are not capable of making any meaningful change, so we should rather just turn away and desensitize. Hitler did what he did not because everybody supported it. He was able to carry out that level of atrocity because he succeeded in marginalizing, dehumanizing the marginalized and making the majority feel numb about that. So when we are posed with the kind of human rights violations that Alex just mentioned, we have to really sit back and think, should we turn the other way because we are not the one who are being directly affected? So that's the question I would like to pose to all of you. Even if we are not the ones who are being directly affected, we have the responsibility as human beings to stand up against what's going on. I know it feels like the people or the power structure that are perpetrating this kind of violence are too powerful and we are too insignificant to do anything. But if we mobilize individually and as a community and stand up, I feel we have hope. And even if we are insignificant as individuals, collectively we can make a difference. Thank you.
All right, to me now. It's a tough comments to follow. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for having me. As Tanha said, we were asked to reflect on the theme of universality, and we were also asked to reflect on the theme of hope. Neither of those are any small task, especially in our current moment, but it did provide a really meaningful opportunity for me to think back on the work that I've done, the people that I've had the privilege of engaging with and learning from. And a specific memory came to mind for me from March 2020, so immediately before the pandemic. We didn't know what was going to happen yet. And I was in Goma in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo doing my doctoral field work. I had spent the day with MONUSCO peacekeepers, moving between the many different MONUSCO bases that were in Goma at the time. I was doing interviews and sitting through meetings and presentations with peacekeepers around the topic of sexual exploitation and abuse. And what was impressed upon me were the incredible barriers to accessing justice, the jurisdictional limitations to achieving just remedy and support for survivors of sexual exploitation and abuse, and how paralyzed the United Nations was to meaningfully redress and solve these problems. Needless to say, when I returned to my hotel room at the end of the day, I was feeling more than a little disheartened, and my heart was very heavy. We pulled in, the driver who kindly took me home, we pulled into the hotel, and it was set up in such a way that there was the parking lot here, and immediately behind it was a very lovely garden. So we pulled in, and I was immediately struck by just how many women were in this garden. And it was women who were dressed in colorful clothes. They had signs, they had banners, they were chanting, they were singing, and they had gathered there to demand equal rights for women in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Their chants and their signs made clear that they would no longer accept, and they rejected, the violence and abuses of women's rights in and around Goma and throughout the DRC. They demanded equal education access for girls, and they demanded equal opportunities to full enjoyment of their human rights. They wrapped up the songs and their chants, and then they took this message to the street in this march that had been organized. It hadn't been advertised anywhere, and as they went, more women came out, men came out, children came out, they joined the march, I joined the march. Everyone was there together carrying this message through the streets of Goma. And it was an incredibly powerful moment for me to see universality come to bear in community, how messages of human rights and the political and normative commitment that underlie our Universal Declaration of Human Rights could be mobilized, useful, and used in communities in ways that were impactful and in ways that connected these rights defenders and activists to a much broader and larger community that expanded well beyond Goma and the Eastern DRC. Turning then to the question of hope, I'll keep us in Eastern DRC, and I'll begin in a not very hopeful situation at all, and that was 1 year ago to this month, almost to the day, when M23, a non-state armed group, overtook Goma. It was, conflict had been resurging and building for some time, but the takeover and the sweeping of M23 and other allied groups into Goma, which is the capital of North Kivu province, was largely unexpected by most in the international community. Certainly took the Congolese armed forces and the UN peacekeeping mission off guard, and M23 succeeded in their intention to take over the city, which they still hold today, a year later. At this time of acute crisis and widespread violence and human rights abuses, peacekeepers were confined to their bases. Foreign mercenaries were rounded up and deported. Congolese military were arrested and detained and held in detention camps, and police officers stayed in their homes. My colleagues who work with civil society organizations in and around Goma in defense of women's rights, in defense of healthcare and social services, they went to work. And so I was receiving WhatsApp messages from my colleagues. I'm asking how they are, if they're okay, if their families are okay. They're like, we're hanging in there and we're at the hospital or we're at the office. And as my brilliant and incredible colleague, Madame Francesca Ferruzzi, who is the head of the Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Program at Heal Africa, told me, this is when their community needed them the most. How could they turn their back on them now? And it's in those words and those commitments that I find the most hope. I've been truly privileged to work with incredible human rights defenders, lawyers, doctors, social workers, survivors, community members, who every day stand up in defense of human rights with the belief that a better community, a better society, and a better world is possible. And they do this work through the most violent and acute and challenging circumstances, often placing their own safety and the safety of their families at great risk. And so if they can show up every day and not turn away and do that work, I'm inspired to stand with them in support of rights, peace, and justice as much as I can. And if I could take just one more minute, I'll bring it a little bit closer to home and say that my other largest source of hope these days are from my students here at Dalhousie, some of whom I'm so thrilled to see in the audience here today. I teach a 4,000 level Law, Justice, and Society seminar. We met yesterday morning, and we had a great discussion. Overall, we were talking about challenges to rule of law and the use of discretion, and I invited them to reflect on the actions undertaken by ICE in Minneapolis that we were all seeing unfold before our eyes with a great degree of horror. The room, I have to say, was electric. Students were informed, they were engaged, they knew what was going on, they had opinions, they had ideas for how to address it. There was a passion, there was an anger, and there was also an energy to affect change. And that's what I've seen consistently through my teaching in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences since I came here in July 2024. Students care about human rights, they're committed to social justice, and they want to be involved in movements to affect change. And it's that passion and that commitment that gives me a lot of hope every day. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. Thank you for showing up today, and I'm very thankful to Alex. I just told Alex that first time I met him was in 2015, 5 days after I landed in Canada, probably. And I told him probably every 10 years we're going to do this. So, so I'm very proud to have celebrated my 10th anniversary in Canada a few weeks ago, landing here from almost a place that I never really imagined we would be at. My family and I, we come from a very rich history and very rich country. When I think about universality, the first thing that comes to my mind, actually, and a part of what Alex has reflected on, start with belonging and peace. Peace is about passion, enthusiasm, advocacy, contribution, and excellence. And I start with passion because it's very important in everything we do. You have to be passionate about the fight for justice, for fairness, for equality, for those that they probably were not given the same opportunities as you did. And we did not realize this until my family and I, we had lost everything in our home country in Syria in 2012 and 2013 that forced us to leave everything behind. So when I keep thinking about human rights when it comes up on the news, and I see the other people around the world that they have lost everything, not because of a fault of their own, just because they were born in the right place but at the wrong time. And when you think about those people, most of the time they are treated with such indifference and apathy. And to give you an example about what that means, and I'm privileged to be behind the microphone. Every time I have a stage or I'm speaking somewhere, I'm behind the podium, I feel really honored and I feel a heavy weight on my shoulders because I'm representing a voice of millions of people, that they do not have a voice, that they were not given the chance to express how they were feeling or how they were treated or how they would like their life to have unfolded. I'm speaking on behalf of my family, of the women in my family, that they shy away all the time from being in public and speaking about the struggles of being refugee immigrants or refugee women or immigrant women who had to lose everything and move to another place. The one story that I keep really thinking about is when our family left Syria to Lebanon as refugees, and we stopped our car after we crossed the border, and then my family asked, what shall we do now? Where shall we go? We know nobody. We have no connection. And then after a few months, when I applied to go to 15 countries around the world, and none of them opened the doors for me and my family, just because they said, we are not taking any Syrian refugees at the time. And then I started volunteering with the United Nations and WHO, and we went to one of the refugee camps in Lebanon. I still remember one of the early days we went on a mobile clinics because of my medical background, and I met a very young child who came to me with such hope, but also wonder. And the first question that he asked me when he was wondering about the condition that his family had to live through after losing everything in the war in Syria. And then the only thing he said to me, why us? Why us? And at that time, probably the kid was around 4 years out of school after his family left the country, left Syria. And then when our family was offered the chance to come to Canada, by the way, there was around probably 100,000 applications at the Canadian Embassy in Beirut. And imagine how many only that Canada has accepted at the time in 2015, 2016. So what really has changed the trajectory of our lives is compassion. And I think in this room as well, probably you don't know, but in this room, there are people who contributed to my presence in Canada, that they have selflessly donated and fundraised and believed in that universality, in that true universality and the genuine universality of human rights, regardless of where we were born, regardless of our faith, regardless of the skin of our color, the color of our skin, regardless of the background that we had, regardless of the ambitions, the hopes, the dreams, the everything that makes us very human. The only thing that mattered to the people that they contributed to the welcome and the acceptance of hundreds of thousands of refugees and immigrants, and continue to do so, is because they believe that these are human beings who deserve to live in safety and peace. And I think that should be the compass that we need to focus on when we are talking about immigration at a time when it's not easy to talk about it. At a time, and that's actually what matters the most. It was so easy to talk about immigration in 2015 and 2016 and 2017, 2018. Right now, it's becoming more difficult. But trust me, right now is truly the time that matters the most, because a lot of people are basically treating it with such indifference. So my hope is that you can come together and think about the opportunities that can be handed to other people who are dreaming of having a better life, a better future, whether they are living as refugees abroad or whether Canada can welcome them here. We were just discussing the topic of family reunification before this panel. Now we're talking how atrocious it is just to think about the separation of family members. Canada is making it more and more difficult. I think, this country was built on a broad range of nationalities and ethnicities coming together to form one of the most successful and wealthiest nations in the history of the world. Raise your hand if you're an immigrant to Canada. Raise your hand if your parents were immigrants to Canada. Raise your hand if your grandparents were immigrants to Canada. Raise your hand if your great-great-grandparents were immigrants to Canada. You see where this is going, right? Raise your hand if you're indigenous. So if you're not indigenous, we all came from somewhere. And that's really the fact that so many people forget these days. So I really want you to reflect for a second. When we talk about immigration, it's not something that is far away that we need to think about. It's something that is happening at our doorsteps, and it's something that we are living with. And imagine the cultures and the roots and the diversity that you're living with in your history. My grandmother used to always say, we have to know where we came from to know where we are going. So I really hope that all of you can reflect today on that concept. I want to finish by saying that universality as well is about giving rights to the powerless and giving those that they are dreaming and yearning for opportunity a chance to have a second chance at life. My family and I were quite lucky to have that, and we are also quite proud to pass it forward to the next generations of refugees and immigrants that we're trying to support with amazing organizations right here at home, outside of Atlantic Canada, etc. I just want to also mention that earlier today I was discussing on a panel the value of immigration to our communities, and Atlantic Canada in particular is one of the only places in Canada that reversed the population decline over the past 2 decades because of immigration, and solely because of immigration. So the only challenge that we're facing right now is not actually the attraction of people, it's the retention. What we can think about is how we treat people with dignity, and how we can attract the best of the best and acknowledge the rights of the people who are coming to our doors, and acknowledge their history, acknowledge their skills, acknowledge their roots, acknowledge their culture, acknowledge their faith, acknowledge their dreams and their ambitions, and support them every step of the way, because that's how we succeed all together. I love to finish always by my favorite quote that says, no one can start today and make a new beginning, but everyone can actually start later and make a new ending. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you to Alex for also having a great lecture. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me all right? I know the mask can muffle sometimes. Okay. Firstly, I also want to say thank you to everyone for coming here today. I think this is a very important conversation at a time when it is only gaining importance. When we were asked to reflect on our perspectives of the universality of human rights and how they have affected our own lives, our own communities, a very simple, very straightforward topic came to mind for me, and that is water. Access to water, Sahwan in Mi'kmaq. I hope it is not a surprise to anyone here that Indigenous communities across Canada continue to face struggles in accessing clean drinking water, from boil water advisories to complete bans on drinking water for fear of the health impacts it can bring. This isn't unique to Canada. It happens across the world. The one that has impacted me the most recently, of course, has been the famine in Gaza and the way that water and food and health resources were systemically taken away from the people of Gaza, were barred access into that land. And the reason behind this is because water, in my mind, is one of the most fundamental human rights. The right to clean drinking water is a corollary to the right to life. It is the basis for so many other universal human rights that we assert across the globe. I can see it in rights to health, rights to life, rights to dignity, and rights to self-determination. In a fractured world, water, scarcity increasingly is linked to conflict and instability. It's something that we are only going to continue to see grow across the world as the climate crisis continues to grow. Unequal access to water in countries like Canada, to me, reflects artificially imposed structural scarcity. And it is, in fact, a goal of the colonial state to impose such a state upon Indigenous people. There is this persistent lack of access to clean drinking water. And yes, there has been quite a bit of action on it lately, but not as much as we need. At the moment, there are 38 drinking water advisories in Indigenous communities across the country. This is actually up from the 32 that were present in 2024. What's notable, though, is in 2013, when then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was elected, one of his first promises was to, within 5 years of his election, provide safe, clean drinking water to every single Indigenous nation and community in the country. And we have yet to see that, more than 10 years later, 16 years later, in fact. This is not a question within a country as rich and influential and blessed as Canada. This is not a question of technical feasibility. Canada has the capacity, Canada has the resources. It's instead a reflection of political prioritization and an unequal valuation of rights for different communities across the nation. There is a universality in what I'm saying here today, in that many of us here today, many of those listening, may at some point in their future face problems in accessing clean drinking water. We are very blessed in Canada to have, I think, the third largest reserve of fresh water in the world. So with that, the question remains, how in 2026 do Indigenous nations still not have access to clean drinking water? Even as Alex pointed out earlier, Indigenous land defenders and Indigenous water defenders have worked tirelessly across every single province of this country to defend our rights. And not just our rights, but the rights of the land itself, the rights of water itself. That example, actually, of a river attaining personhood, to me, is where I draw the hope in what I'm saying. And I know this is a dire conversation. To me, when I think of hope in relation to international or universal human rights, and also in relation to things like the climate crisis, things that we are all going to have to deal with, what I believe, and perhaps I'm a bit biased in this, is that many of the answers lie in Indigenous legal orders. Indigenous law is a source of protection for the world that we exist within. And it is within those legal orders that we can find the principles and the values that we need to correct our path as common people of this world. So, I've already gone a bit over time. So what I want to say is, think about the legal orders of the Indigenous nations present in the territories on which you reside. The name of my law lodge, Ulnaway de Bludachan Wigwam. It is Indigenous Law Lodge, or more specifically, Mi'kmaq Law Lodge. All of you here present today in Mi'kma'ki are acting within, existing within, a territory that is also governed by the legal orders of the Mi'kmaq. I encourage everyone present here today to explore those legal orders, have conversations about them, and think about how we can defend the place of Indigenous legal orders in the conversation about universal human rights. Thank you. Well,
Okay, and Kristin, you're not the only one. We've all gone over. We were a little late getting started. I do want to open the floor to some questions. We're recording this for the YouTube channel, so I will repeat your questions for that sake, not because we don't understand you. Just wanted to be clear about that. Does anyone like to start with a question? Jeff, to your left. To my left? Where? There you go.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much to Alex and the other panelists. This is fantastic. I was teaching Rousseau earlier today, and we're reading social contract to kind of grapple with that age-old problem of how you get people to follow or respond to the common good. You know, how is it that man is born free, but everyone doesn't change? Take that from your quote. And I suppose the big question I have to Alex, but maybe to other panelists is there a way that the power of universal human rights is sometimes most powerful when it's particularized? That is, when it becomes concretely linked to, our sense of our implication in claims of morality or international law. And I'm reminded here particularly of, the Syrian refugee crisis and Canada's response. Canada was seemingly as indifferent as most countries in the world until that picture and that story of Alan Kurdi's family trying to make its way to Canada suddenly made Canadians implicated. No longer the generalized claims of morality. This was about what Canada had failed to do. So I wonder, Alice, what your thoughts are about how universality might actually need to partake of particularity to become meaningful.
So for the YouTube channel, how does universality, or how can universality make use of particularity to be empowered and be more actionable?
I like it, the particularity of universality.
Yeah.
I think it's a great question, and immediately for me, two dimensions of that particularity arise. One is, and I think this is reflected in the tragedy, but the incredible power of the image of Alan Kurdi's body, and that is no question that when these incredibly overwhelming global challenges, concerns that seem, number one, seem far away from us, but number two, seem far beyond in any way our ability to understand the scope and nature of the challenge, but also to in any meaningful way kind of engage with it and find a way forward. That when it becomes human, and obviously in this case, sadly, the death of a child, that breaks through a lot of that. I think the story that I shared of Monia Mazig's campaigning, I was right alongside her throughout all of that, and I saw the early days when she would gather at the Centennial Flame on Parliament Hill, and 3 people would come. But then she persisted, and what she persisted in was storytelling to anyone and everyone she could, whether it be in the media, whether it be to those 3 people around the Centennial Flame, and others started to tell the story. And then suddenly something which at that time seemed, I know not everyone here will remember those days of post 9/11, but they're perhaps, it's odd to say that, maybe not as daunting and crazy as the days we face now, but they were pretty horrific, and it seemed enormous. The machinery of the United States had unleashed this global war on terror, supposedly, war on human rights, more in my mind, and it seemed beyond the capacity of anyone to engage with it. It was fearful to do so because if you spoke out, you were going to be called a terrorist sympathizer, etc. But then suddenly there was Monia Mazig with a very human story that you suddenly realized this was about the family that lives down the block from me. And things began to shift dramatically. So that's one part of particularity. This is all about human rights, and so let's really focus on the human part of that. The other is, and there's, I should have it memorized as which lecture it was, but in one of the lectures I referred to some of this research. There's been some interesting research done that shows a bit of a dichotomy between the fact that people can be polled and show quite high levels of support for kind of the values and the concepts and the sentiment of human rights, while at the same time, and even in that same group, have low levels of belief in it, and low levels of kind of willingness to do anything about it. And what it really started to point to was the fact that beautiful, lofty, poetic promises are easy to get behind, but unless and until people really see and appreciate the concrete reality of those promises, including in their own lives or at least in the community around them, it's even in the best of times, which I think we all agree we're not living in right now, even in the best of times, it's easy to ignore and push away sort of what human rights may call on us. And so that's that notion of, so maybe the other side of particularity, if the first was is let's make it human, I think the second is let's make it real. And I think all of us in human rights movements, it is incumbent upon us to really make it clear to people that this, including in your own lives, this isn't just about lofty ideals, this is about solutions. This is about addressing the things that are of concern to you and in your community.
I also think there is a structural element to this particularity of the universality of human rights. I just kind of thinking of the Syrian issue and now with Ukraine and Palestine, when last year or the year before, the number of Ukrainians that were let in Canada because of the war, and if we see the number of Palestinians that came, there's a massive discrepancy, and they will say security clearance and stuff like that, but you can see, like, whether you call it particularity or selectivity, there is a bias in who we think is more deserving to be humanized, and that has implication about who gets to access those rights.
I wonder if it's a matter too of who, like with the Palestinian as well, by admitting them as refugees, what statement are you making internationally about what's happening to them? Is there any? Yes.
I wrote it down so I wouldn't make a speech. Are the coalitions that may become necessary to resist fascism from the United States destined to violate the universality of human rights?
Are the coalitions that will have to arise to oppose the United States destined to
Violate the universality
violate
of
the universality of human
rights?
rights?
Coalition violate the universality of human rights.
Do I get to start that, or anyone else want to? So I assume by coalition you're envisioning military coalitions or coalitions that are going to use some.
I'm thinking about all the possible kinds of coalitions and compromises and things that may have to happen to resist this particular fascist government south of the border.
So, I mean, I guess I'm a universal purist, and I know this is often a tough line and position to hold, but I do, and this isn't just about lofty idealism, I do fundamentally believe that when we start to allow the commitment to universality to slide, we find ourselves on a slippery slope, and we don't know where to stop. And we've had this debate in other contexts. I mean, to go back to 9/11 again. I mean, no, it's a different constellation of actors, although not totally. But of course, we were having that debate then about security versus human rights. I think you're putting on the table fascism and human rights, and of course there were many vociferous, impassioned, and well-placed voices that said, well, what we face right now is such that we do need to be ready to tolerate human rights violations. And of course, the particular debate that arose then was around torture in particular, which for decades has always been defined and enshrined as an absolute, unconditional, unequivocal human right, breached all the time, but nonetheless framed in those unconditional terms. And suddenly we were having a debate about, well, but maybe this kind of person, maybe Osama bin Laden, or maybe the person who knows where Osama bin Laden is hiding, or maybe the sister of the person who knows where Osama bin Laden is hiding, and someone who goes to the same mosque, and someone who's, and on it goes, right? And that's, those of us who think back to that time, and that's what Meher Arar's experience was all about. He was way down that slippery slope. And as seductive as it was in some corners, it took us absolutely nowhere. It took us to very bad places, even if we did have serious security concerns to deal with. And I think I would kind of transpose that same concern into the context that that you're highlighting for us, that we just can't, because universal means universal. And if we, for whatever reason, well-intentioned desperation, but also racist and discriminatory, but whatever it may be, if we start carving out the exceptions, then it just doesn't end.
Hello, I just want to say thank you very much for this lecture. So this came to me when Alex we were talking about Canada specifically, and so I wrote it down so it's on my as well.
You put fear into them all, Joe.
And this can be answered by anybody, but would the reinforcement of domestic, local, and national legal rights mechanisms improve the enforcement and realization of human rights across citizens, and therefore impacting the application of universal human rights? And if yes, how?
YouTube, good luck.
I can start because I've written a 75-page paper on this. Yes. There you go. That's my answer. I think you have framed one of the most essential deficiencies, challenges, and downfalls when it comes to the realization of human rights, but also have pointed to one of the most important opportunities and openings that we should really be pursuing. And that is what we often refer to in the human rights world as the implementation gap. We could quite quickly have a stack of papers that would go way beyond this ceiling, which are all of the amazing treaties and conventions and declarations and resolutions and guiding principles and codes of conduct, and I can go on and on and on, which are detailed and eloquent and inspiring and make a universe of promises to every single one of us. There's hardly now a human rights topic. There's still a couple they're working at. There's negotiations underway now for a treaty on older persons, for instance. But we've got it. We've got the promises, and they're beautiful and they're compelling. We just have this huge implementation gap at every level, certainly internationally, where the international legal system is a different order of law, and it is more challenging to implement at that level. But to go to your point in particular, what we're quite lacking in here in Canada is we have nothing meaningful in place that translates our international legal obligations. I think sometimes government, and I think even many members of the public, think that the international stuff is about everyone else. No. Since when was there a footnote that said Canada's not part of Universal, or that we're not part of the international community? Of course these treaties apply to us, and they have incredibly important provisions for the rights of Indigenous peoples and refugees and gender equality, and on goes the list. Housing and anti-poverty concerns, the climate crisis. I mean, these treaties speak to all of the pressing human rights challenges we face domestically. But we have everything in our legal systems and our political systems does everything it can to keep that at bay. We have an approach that, for the most part, says that that's not really the business of the courts. They can use those international instruments, and some judges are getting courageous about this, to help interpret existing law, but they can't take those treaties into court and and issue an order saying, Canada, you must live up to your international obligations to ensure safe water in Indigenous communities across the country. And similarly in our political system, it just gets, I mean, this would be a 2-hour lecture. Here's the 30-second version of it. It gets lost in the morass of federalism is what happens. Federal, provincial, territorial governments, and human rights is not unique. We know this happens in federalism all the time. They just love to pass the buck and point fingers at each other and complain and guard their territory. And in the midst of that, don't rise to what international law expects of them. And that is that those incredibly important universal human rights obligations applicable to Canada as a whole, not applicable to the federal government, not applicable to the government of Nova Scotia, applicable to Canada as a country, as a nation, obliges us to get our act together and ensure that all 14 federal, provincial, and territorial governments row in the same direction, and they do so in unison with one thing as their purpose. And that is to ensure that they are, in their laws, in their budgets, in their programs, in their services, the decisions they make every single day, how they have discussions around the cabinet table, the first thing they're asking themselves is, what does universal human rights require of us? That may seem like a very high mountain to climb, but I think we can push ourselves and our leaders up that mountain because it's the only direction we should be headed.
Thank you. And that's really hard to follow. But I did want to say, in this conversation of human rights as applied in the national level, I always almost feel a bit cynical when I approach it, because Canada as a country is founded upon broken promises. You know, I think about the promises that were broken in the peace and friendship treaties probably every day. That affects every aspect of our law, our governance, and the way we interpret human rights in Canada. I truly believe that recognition in things like international instruments without timely implementation actually weakens rights protection. And in reality, it almost helps, it inflicts a loss of normative force upon those instruments. You know, Canada has now had several instances in which very explicitly the relationship between the Government of Canada and Indigenous peoples has been called out. I think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to action associated with it. I also think more recently of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act that calls for Canada's legal system to completely align itself with those outlines of what Indigenous rights are, of what Indigenous self-determination is. And I see again and again that those are placed on the back burner, that those are deprioritized for whatever reason. I have personal experience in speaking with lawmakers, with policymakers about the United Nations Declaration, and it has shocked me almost every single time how little force they think is behind it, how little effect they think it has on our legal system, when in my perspective, it affects it in every single way, in every possible way, at a very fundamental level. So, yes, absolutely. That is all to say, I think we must understand the need to recognize universal human rights at a national level. But while doing so, I think we also have to recognize the history of our country, what has been brought to the table in the creation of Canada, and the many broken promises that trail behind our government, our constitution. I think it is easier sometimes for people to make change if they think it is within their control. And I do think many of the people here in Canada, in this room, can affect that change in Canada. I believe Alex said before, like, it only takes one person. And that's the most important thing.
Yes, sir.
I'm just not gonna take long, but I want to reflect on the fact, the reason why a lot of us are so excited to live in a country like Canada is because we believed and we still believe it is a country of freedoms and human rights, and that was kind of the sole purpose that that our family and so many others across the country, have been dreaming about since, we have been lacking access to the basics of human rights in our home country. And that is something we want to continue to see flourish and prosper and expand. And it's getting more difficult by the day when you are watching the news and see what's going on down the border. And to be honest, I'm hopeful by nature. I'm optimistic by nature. And I like to think about things in a light and bright way. As this country has restored my faith in humanity 10 years ago, and I hope it continues to do so for so many others who are dreaming about it. But it is a complex country. Like when you travel across Canada, the second largest country in the world, you feel like you're crossing borders between countries. Like in the same distance you're traveling in Europe, you'll be crossing 10 countries. And I feel always, how lucky we are that we have come to that mutual understanding that we share these same values, no matter where we live, no matter what our postal code is. And these postal codes that do not determine what rights are we going to get, how much clean water we're going to get still for indigenous community. That is the main issue. But what I'm the most proud of is that when I'm in a parking lot, I don't have to worry about federal agents asking me for my driver's license and determine if they're going to take me or treat me as a class 2 citizen because of my last name or because of my skin color. And that prejudice for so many people who are living right now in Canada and so many other countries as well is kind of sounding the alarm, for what human rights truly are all about. And are we really equal, in that sense when so many of our political leaders are trying to pick and choose in terms of who they support, from what country should we bring in immigrants and why should we talk about immigration in a way only for labor matching, that someone else doesn't want to do this job, so let's bring someone from other countries who are going to cover for this, and when we don't need them anymore, let's shut down the borders because the job is done. And that is really kind of the heart of Canada's human rights strategies. I really believe should also continue to talk about how we face the anger that is out there in the world right now with humility, but also with understanding the reasoning behind it, and how can we bring people together. And it is everyone's responsibility when we talk about this. So the main danger that is facing the world right now is not really that anger and hate, it's the numbness. It's becoming numb to what we are watching on the news, becoming numb to the violations of the very humanity that we are pretending to be defending. We're sick of wars, across the world that are killing innocent people because of so many causes and reasons that we have been, we have been listening about. And I think right now is really the time for everyone here in Canada to come together and ask ourselves, what is the Canada of the future that we really want to see? I know over the past few days we've been hearing about the old world order that has been eroded or erupted. I think it is in our hands to build the next world order. Thank you.
Yeah, we have one up here. You, sir? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Alex and the panel. I just had a question in terms of, I know you probably covered this earlier in the series, but what can we learn from the original concept of Universal Declaration? When we go back to what was envisioned when it was first brought forward and to move forward to the number of fees and opportunities we're not meeting now, and we should be meeting. And the concept I like you had with human rights assemblies, that idea of something that should be brought forward and promoted as a way to positively promote human rights.
So again, for YouTube, what I understand is what could be learned by revisiting the intent and what the original authors of the Declaration laid out?
I would refer you to lecture 2. But no, it's a very important question, and I when I started off to write the lectures, I didn't really think I was going to go much back into history. And it's not a huge part, but it did realize for exactly the reason you've framed it. And it's in keeping, I think, Tareq, you said your grandmother, is it? The one who says we need to look back in order to know where we're going forward. There are fables and parables of that throughout many, many cultures. And I think it is really important here. And when we do go back, I mean, in the lecture, I go way back. I go like 5,000 years back. But let's go back to what you framed, 1948. And I think we learn an enormous amount from doing so, because there's this incredible 6-year period where the international community, newly founded, established, comes together and creates the United Nations, creates the International Court of Justice, convenes the Nuremberg Tribunal, passes the Genocide Convention, passes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passes 1, 2, 3, 4 Geneva Conventions dealing with the laws of war, and passes the Refugee Convention. That's in 6 years. Does anyone think we would get halfway down the road of one of those things in a decade in today's world? Of course not. And I think the other thing to throw into the mix then is, what was that time? Well, it was a fearful, ugly, fraught, divided, violent time. The world had seen some of the most unbelievable explosions of hate through the Holocaust that humanity had ever experienced. The carnage of the war was surpassed the totality of all previous wars known to humanity. The economic despair and dislocation and suffering afterwards, the levels of forced displacement were incredible. And so at that moment in history, did those states coming together set out to, well, let's build walls, let's create fortresses, let's figure out how to only look after ourselves? They did exactly the opposite. And these sort of magnificent documents, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, yes, there's aspects in ways in which it's dated. I talked about the fact, I think, I can't remember what I've said in my lecture, but, for instance, that it doesn't touch directly on the environment and climate, etc. And there's other things that aren't there directly. But 80 years on, it still speaks to what we are as human beings, what we need to be to each other as human beings, and what we need and yearn for in our lives. And at the fact that governments knew that was the recipe for what ailed the world at that time. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's exactly the same world we've got in 2025, 2026, but there's some similarities, aren't there? And so I think what we learn and teach ourselves by looking back is we actually got it right then. We didn't stay on that path. Boy, we didn't stay on that path. And there's a lot to learn from that as well as to what kicked us off the path and who wasn't leading us on the right paths and who wasn't being listened to around what paths needed to be followed. But that I think it reinforces in us some confidence that it is the right thing.
I think we have one more question. We only have time, I'm sorry, for one more, but you down here in the blue, you had one earlier?
I was wondering what we can do to convince the Canadian government to speed up the refugee application process so we can bring more refugees to Canada.
So the question is, the young woman is wondering what we can do to speed up the refugee application process so more folks can come to Canada.
You want me to start? That's such an important question, and it's it's important, I think, on two levels. Number one, it reminds us, as Tareq's reflections did very powerfully as well, of how central, meaningful, universal refugee protection is to the wider dream of human rights. It's at the core, both in the sense of if we have meaningful, universal refugee protection, we are hopefully doing all we can to prevent human rights violations, right? This is keeping people, this is offering safety from people so that they won't go through the violations. And it also reminds us, and Tareq did as well, that we're quite proud of that, and we do have, not unblemished, and sometimes I think we overstate it a bit, but we do have a lot to be proud of as a country. So how is it that we're now in this moment where in so many respects, I talked about the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement as a disgraceful example of a way in which we're moving away from that. And then we've got bureaucratic channels like the one you're talking about, the fact that it takes not the days or weeks that it should take to ensure that someone who's at grave risk receives the protection and, whether it's resettlement from abroad or having status bestowed if they're already here in the country. And instead, it's not even that it's taking months, it's taking years and years, and the figures are only mounting. I think the specific thing you ask is how do we change it? And I would say it's us. I mean, I think that's one of the core messages that has come through for me throughout this whole Massey process is that at the end of the day, power rests with us. We've got power. I think in far too many instances, it's easy to convince ourselves we don't. Other people, the forces against us, convince us we don't have that power. It's easier to not get involved and take action, but it's when we mobilize. And there's lots of ways, lots of organizations that are very active on that. You could look through the Canadian Council for Refugees, for instance, and find allies who will point to petitions and community level organizing. Lawyers are looking at this around legal challenges, but there's a place for everyone in making change happen, and there's absolutely a place for you.
Tanha's going to weigh in. I just want to say, because I know there are other questions, we're not going to do any more questions here. There is, after this, a reception upstairs. The panelists will be available, so you can put your questions to them specifically. But
I just want to make a comment to Mr. Neve that when he talked about one person making a difference, I immediately thought of Rosa Parks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough.
And history is full of Rosa Parkses.
Yeah, Tanha.
Sorry to intervene, but this is what I exactly research about. So the program that Tareq came to, and I think you were also mentioning about the private refugee sponsorship program, right? So what is happening throughout the last few years is that IRCC has been changing policies without consultation with the stakeholders, like sponsorship groups like you and the organizations that help sponsorship groups, which is making the sponsorship process more difficult and burdensome for people who do this on a voluntary basis. And it has been becoming increasingly difficult for the agreement holders to meet the government regulations. So it's like the bureaucratic regulations, and what I think is they are trying to decrease the number of privately sponsored refugees. That's one of the things that is playing here, and I think that program is currently on hold. So sorry to break the news to you, it's going to take longer, but hopefully we can make a change.
Hi folks, I'm here to say the closing remarks and to thank you all. I just want to say to the speakers, we have gifts for you, but I can't carry all of the bags up at one spot, so just hold out afterward and I will give them to you.
It's a good sign, actually.
Yeah, it's a very good sign. There's too much stuff, right? And Elizabeth, thank you for organizing those. She did a fantastic job. I just want to start by thanking our speakers for the evening as we go across. Here, I'm going to move over here so I can see all the names. Tanha Tanjila from the International Development Studies Program. We've got Alex, obviously, who is our star. Thank you so much for your words and for your book. Heather Tasker from Political Science. Tareq Hadhad from Peace by Chocolate for your words. And Kristin Belanger, again, for your work at the Law Library. Okay. And thank you so much to Jeff for his moderating of this. We really appreciate it. I also want to thank the co-hosts for the evening. Just to remind you, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, the Dallaire Institute, and the chocolate that is being sold in the lobby is in support of the Dallaire Institute, so please buy lots of bars from Peace by Chocolate. The Center for the Study of Security and Development, and the Schulich School of Law. So I'd ask you to please join us upstairs in the atrium. on the second floor for coffee and a chance to continue the conversation, I would remind you that Bookmark is selling the collection of lectures that Alex gave out in the lobby.
And I've got a pen.
Excellent. So if you want a signed copy, this is a fantastic book. I just want to put a plug in. It was amazing. I read it over the last week and I was truly moved by it. So thank you so much to everybody for being here tonight, and to the overflow room for being so patient in the other room. And I hope you have a really good evening.